Okay, Psalm 93. That's where we'll be. Psalm 93. The Lord reigneth. Notice those next two words. He is. The Lord reigneth. He is. He is clothed with majesty. The Lord is. The Lord is. Clothed with strength, wherewith strength he hath girded himself. The world also is established, it cannot be moved. Thy throne is established of old, thou art from everlasting. The floods have lifted up, O Lord. The floods have lifted up their voice. The floods lift up their waves. The Lord on high is mightier than the noise of many waters, yea, than the mighty waves of the sea. Thy testimonies are very sure. Holiness becometh thine house, O Lord, forever. It's a very brief psalm. You'll notice that there is no title. The name of the author is not mentioned. There's nothing about the occasion when it was written. But we're not left with any doubt concerning the subject of the psalm. We see that in the first three words. The Lord reigneth. The Lord reigneth. The rest of the psalm is the development of that subject. The Lord reigneth. Now from verse 3, it appears that the psalm was composed during some time of threat to the people of God, and to encourage the people of God with this thought: the Lord reigneth. It is a psalm that celebrates the Lord reigning. So again, the subject, the theme, the central thought, the focus of the psalm is not verse 3, the floods have lifted up, the floods have lifted up their voice, the floods lift up their waves. That's not the focus. The focus is the Lord reigneth. And as we've said over and over, the happenings and events of life, they're never to be the central thought and focus. The Lord reigneth. That's to be the focus. And in the psalm, the psalmist speaks of the Lord reigning. He speaks about this, and he speaks to the Lord. Notice verse 1. He speaks in third person. That is, he's talking about God in verse 1. In verse 2, he is speaking in second person. He says, thy throne. He's talking to God. So in verse 1, he's talking of God. And in verses 2 and 3, he's talking to God. In verse 4, he again speaks in third person. He says, the Lord on high is mightier than. He's speaking about God. And then in verse 5, he returns the second person. He's talking to God. So he talks about God. Anybody can do that. But he also talks to God. He had a knowledge of the fact that God reigns. But more importantly, he knew the God who reigns. So he talks to him. And that's our subject. Knowing that God reigns and knowing the God who reigns. That's what we need. We need to know without any doubt in our minds that God reigns. And more importantly than that, we need to be able to talk to Him. We often need to be reminded afresh and anew of the fact that God reigns. We lose sight of that from time to time. We get caught up in verse 3, and we lose sight of the fact that God reigns. But that fact is much more meaningful and relevant to us when we know the God who reigns. So let's consider first of all the fact of God's reign. I don't understand why anyone would want a God who's not in control, who is not great, who does not reign. It is a fact. The Lord reigneth. We need to know that truth. The Lord reigneth. It's a truth to be rejoiced in. It's a truth to be openly declared. 1 Chronicles 16:31, let the heavens be glad and the earth rejoice, and let men say among the nations, the Lord reigneth. Psalm 96:10, say among the heathen, the Lord reigneth. The Lord reigneth. The heathen don't need our opinions. They need to know the Lord reigneth. Psalm 97:1, the Lord reigneth. Let the earth rejoice. Let the multitudes of isles be glad thereof. So from those verses we see that this is not a subject that we should stand opposed to. It's not a subject we should resist. It's a subject of rejoicing. The Lord reigneth. And it is a subject that all need to be aware of. The Lord reigneth. I believe with all of my heart that God has a plan and He is working that plan perfectly. He reigns. He reigns. It's a subject that ought to result in awe, reverence, and great humility. Read in Psalm 99:1, the Lord reigneth. Let the people tremble. It is a fact that ought to impact us. Let the people tremble. A personal awareness of the fact the Lord reigneth will cause you and I to take our proper place before God, which is always has the subject. The Lord reigneth. That's the first three words of our psalm. Then there's a comma. So it's a compound sentence. But those first three words, the Lord reigneth, can be a sentence. It is a complete thought. The Lord reigneth. It is not the Lord and fill in the blank reigns. It's not fate that reigns. It's not circumstances, but the Lord reigneth. As we said earlier, He reigns exclusively. The Lord reigneth. It's present tense. It's ongoing. He'll be reigning tomorrow as well. It is a statement that He reigns continually. The Lord reigneth. Nothing changes the fact. The Lord reigneth. The Lord reigneth. That statement, the Lord reigneth, is not passive, but it's active. It is a statement that He reigns actively. In other words, He's not impotent. He's not indifferent. He's not a mere spectator, hoping that things turn out well. He actively reigns. The Lord reigneth. Notice those words, the Lord reigneth. No qualifying words. No words to establish boundaries or designated areas where He reigns. It is simply a statement of absolute reign. The Lord reigneth. We read in Psalm 103:19, the Lord hath prepared or established His throne in the heavens, and His kingdom ruleth over all. If there's any place where God does not reign, if there's any place where God does not exercise dominion, then He's not God in that place. And if He's not God there, He's not God. He exercises His dominion and is absolute sovereign in every realm. The Lord reigneth. That means He is the absolute authority. He possesses dominion over all. He reigns. That means that He rules. He's in control of all things. And He does so as He pleases. And as we said earlier, none can thwart His purposes. But God presented in this book rules. He's in control. He manages. He directs. He guides. He governs. And He does so as He pleases. Well, if I were God, you're not, so don't even go there. The Lord reigneth. Always the Lord reigneth. Everywhere the Lord reigneth. The God that we read of in the Word of God, very, very different from the God that many profess. A God who created everything by personal and direct action. Yet that same God cannot regulate the works of His own hands. That's pitiful. But that's what many believe. The God that is presented in this book is quite different from the God that is declared in most pulpits. A God who rules and reigns over nothing. A God who is a puppet. The God declared for most pulpits today is a God who is filled with benevolent intentions, Yet poor God cannot carry them out because man won't let him. In other words, he's a subject to the whims of man, a mere puppet with man pulling the strings. But this book declares, the Lord reigneth. Say it over and over again. The Lord reigneth. That needs to be deeply rooted in our minds. That needs to be deeply rooted in our hearts. People are trying to explain the world. They're trying to explain events. They try to explain the weather without God. Can't be done. God still is, and He still reigns. The Lord reigneth. He is the most prominent. He is the most influential. No one more prominent than God. No one more influential than God. The Lord reigneth, regardless. The Lord reigneth. That's a truth that we need to hold more firmly. It's a truth we need to believe more fixedly. Everyone here knows this fact. The Lord reigneth. Do we know the one who reigns? The Lord reigneth. So let's consider some facts concerning this truth. In this 93rd Psalm, the psalmist paints a word picture of the Lord reigneth. That's what he does. He paints a picture of the Lord reigning. And what the psalmist goes on to say ought to fascinate us, it ought to inspire us, it ought to stimulate us. He says several things about the Lord's reign. Number one, He reigns majestically. Notice what it says. He, that is the Lord who reigns, is right now in His reign. The Lord, He is clothed. That is, He's wrapped, He's arrayed, He's blanketed with majesty, with dignity, with magnificence, with splendor, with glory. He reigns majestically. He is clothed with majesty. Everything about Him is majestic. And He reigns. Do you know Him? Secondly, He reigns powerfully. Notice again verse 1. The Lord, again the one who reigns, is right now in His reign, clothed, again wrapped, arrayed, blanketed, with strength. It is with power, force, might, energy, and ability, wherewith strength He hath girded, encompassed Himself. Again, He is the Almighty God. This goes beyond what is stated in 2 Chronicles 25:8, God hath power. Yes, He does. God has power. But this is something that goes beyond that. Psalm 62:11, power belongeth unto God. That's true. But He not only possesses power, both those verses declare that He possesses power, but He is Almighty. I am the Almighty. He doesn't just possess power. He is power. He is all might. And He reigneth. What is His power? Himself. It's who He is. And therefore it's as great as Himself. And therefore in Romans 1 verse 20, it's referred to as His eternal power. It's as great as Himself. It's infinite. It's incomprehensible. Job 26:14, but the thunder of His power, who can understand? Every now and then, God will send a natural disaster, and it ought to cause people to be aware of the power of God. What God can do with the waters. What God can do with the wind. And He can do much more than what He does. But it just manifests that He has all might. And not only does He have all might, He is all might. He is a God who can. And He reigns. And He reigns. We read in Jeremiah 32:17, nothing is too hard for Thee. How could it be? He's almighty. What can be too hard for Almight? What is beyond Almight? We read in Ephesians 3 verse 20, He is able to do exceeding abundantly above all that we ask or think. He is able. Those words need to be viewed in the context of all might. He reigns majestically. He reigns powerfully. Thirdly, verse 2, His reign is fixed. It says, Thy throne is established. That means it is firmly set. It is secure. Sin is rampant. Everywhere is lawlessness and unrest and opposition, defiance. Evil men and seducers wax worse and worse. Everything appears to be out of joint, and throughout history, thrones have tottered, dynasties have been overturned. Civilization has been proven to be a failure. And the so-called wise are perplexed, incompetent to face what confronts society today. But there is absolutely no threat to the throne of this one who reigns supreme, majestically, and powerfully. And the psalmist not only knew of Him, he knew Him, and he talked to Him. Fourthly, His reign is eternal. Verse 2, Thou art, that is the Lord who reigns, majestically and powerfully. Thou art from everlasting. His reign is from everlasting. There's never been a time when God was not reigning. There will never be a time when God is not reigning. The Lord reigneth. We hear Him say in Malachi 3:6, I am the Lord, I change not. He reigns. Regardless of appearance, regardless of what God appears to do or does not do, God is what He's always been, and the Lord reigneth. His reign is all enduring. It's eternal. His throne is triumphant. That's fifth. His reign is triumphant. This is seen in verses 3 and 4, where the psalmist draws a picture of surging floods and the uprising sea. There's a picture of surging force, surging power. The psalmist gives no specific explanation of what he means by the use of water here in verses 2 and 3, or verses 3 and 4. The flood and the sea are used to represent a variety of things throughout the Word of God. The emphasis here is not the flood or the sea. The emphasis is in verse 4. The Lord on high is mightier than. His power, His ability are more than the floods, more than the mighty waves of the sea. But in these images, verses 3 and 4, mostly verse 3, there's an image of changing circumstances. 3 statements in verse 3. The floods have lifted up. That means there's a stirring. There's an agitation. Secondly, the floods have lifted up their voice. That is, they've become louder. And then thirdly, the floods have lifted up their waves. Now there's a change in appearance. And in verse 4, 2 statements that we want to notice. The noise of many waters and the mighty waves of the sea. 5 statements. And these speak of detrimental change. These changes can occur in every aspect of our life. Can occur in health. You may find out tomorrow that you have stage 4 cancer or some deadly disease. Changes. But the Lord reigneth. Changes come in finances. You may be broke tomorrow. You may be rich tomorrow. Changes come in career. You may find out tomorrow you no longer have a job. Changes come in relationships. I doubt it's going to happen, but you may find out tomorrow that your wife or husband left. Changes happen. Spiritual changes. And these changes can be bewildering, very fearful, can cause great stress. It can interrupt our lives. They can change our lives for the rest of our life. But there are no unforeseen events with God. What we read here in verses 3 and 4 is an image of trials. The word floods speak of that which brings devastation. It's a disaster, a calamity, danger, great need. It speaks of that which can bring ruin and great loss. The floods speak of that which is difficult that which proves to be a trial, a battle, that which brings great suffering and sorrow and heartache. Floods can cause great turmoil and can be a huge obstacle. But the floods speak of an inundation, a deluge, a torrent, an overflow, a succession. Notice, if you keep a mark there and go to Psalm 69. Psalm 69, verses 1 and 2. Save me, O God, for the waters are come in unto my soul. I sink in deep mire where there is no standing. I am come into deep waters where the floods overflow me. Verse 14, deliver me out of the mire and let me not sink. Let me be delivered from them that hate me and out of the deep waters. Let not the water flood overflow me. Neither let the deep swallow me up, and let not the pit shut her mouth upon me. He's speaking of that which is engulfing. And here in Psalm 93, the floods speak of that which is engulfing, where there's no standing. And though these may be overwhelming, there are no emergencies with God. None. He reigns. He's the one who sets the bounds of the waters, the seas, and He's the one who can allow the waters to go over their bounds. He's in control. What we see here in Psalm 93, the floods. The floods have lifted up. The floods lift up their waves. It's a picture of something that is fearful. It speaks of upheaval, pandemonium, dire straits. By the end of this day, we may be in the midst of upheaval and pandemonium. That which causes great fear and distress and anxiety and even panic. But the Lord reigneth. There is an image here of the threat of an enemy. The Lord uses the image of a flood in the Scriptures to picture an enemy power. Read Isaiah chapter 8, verses 7 and 8. Isaiah 17, verses 12 and 13. He presents the floods, the seas, as a picture of an enemy power. In Isaiah 59 and verse 19, when the enemy shall come in like a flood. Oh, the agitation, the fury, the wrath, the resentment of those who hate God, who are offended by God, who are hostile toward God. They ignore God, they reject God and His ways. They're held in the grips of humanism. Humanism's, the motto is good without God. That's the motto. You can see it on all their letterheads, good without God. They have perverted philosophies and ideas. They begin with man and not God. You'll always come to the wrong conclusion when you begin with man and not God. They're absorbed with their philosophies. They're relentless. They're determined in carrying out their agenda. They not only promote but they approve and glamorize and applaud and celebrate that which is abominable. These are enemies. They're bent on redefining. They're bent on justifying and minimizing sin. And this is a flood that is upon us. Nothing worse than being in a flood and you don't even have the sense to know there's a flood. I mean, that's pretty bad. You're going to drown. But that's where we are today. A flood's upon us, and most have no sense at all that they're even in a flood. But the Lord reigneth. The Lord reigneth. We see here also an image of the sinful nature of man. The Lord uses the image of the sea to picture the filth of man's nature. In Isaiah 57:20, the wicked are like the troubled sea, when it cannot rest, whose waters cast up mire and dirt. Like the sea, man spews forth the mire and the dirt of his own sinful, depraved heart. And today, there is a torrent of filth that is everywhere. When floods come and the floodwaters begin to subside, there's a great danger of disease because of all the filth that the floodwaters bring in. And this is a threat. Threatens schools, government, courts, entertainment industry, homes, churches. But like the sea, man is restless, he's unstable, he's insecure, but the Lord reigneth. So what is pictured in verses 4 and 5, or verses 3 and 4, is incessant. It's floods. It's sustained. It's relentless. It's persistent. But the thing to remember and focus upon is not what we read in verses 3 and 4, but what we read in verse 4, the Lord on high. The Lord on high rules, has all authority. He is above the floodwaters. Cast his shadow upon the floods. He's exalted. He's beyond all. He's exalted above the pandemonium and the upheaval and the dire straits. He's not only on high, but Psalm 91 verse 1 says He is the Most High. He is more than whatever the changes are. Do we know the one who reigns? Do we talk to the one who reigns? Sixthly, His reign is one of truth. In spite of the floods, in spite of the mighty waves of the sea, we read in verse 5, Thy testimonies are very sure. In the midst of instability, Thy testimonies are sure. All through this book are the testimonies of God, the one who reigneth. And the testimonies of God are absolutely certain. They are guaranteed. They are unfailing. They are unerring. They are absolutely reliable. They are dependable. They are trustworthy. The Lord reigneth. The Lord reigneth. He's in control of all things. And He's moving all things to their final end. That ought to encourage the child of God. But today, it doesn't seem to. It seems to get the child of God all anxious, all angry. We ought to be rejoicing. We see the end is coming. God is working all things according to His will. His reign is one of righteousness. Notice verse 5. Holiness becometh thine house, O Lord, forever. His reign is always just. You and I may not be able to explain all things that God does or does not do. But you got to know this. I don't have to explain God. You don't have to explain God. You just believe that whatever He does or does not do is right. Because He's God. His reign is one of righteousness. Why did God allow that to happen? I don't know. But He's God. And He's right. Why doesn't God stop that? I don't know. But He's God. And He's right. Don't get all caught up in what you think God ought to do and what He ought not to do. Just rejoice that He's God and that He reigns. Again, the subject and the theme of the psalm is the Lord reigneth. And what the psalmist says throughout the psalm reveals what we talked about earlier, the greatness of God. In many quote-unquote Christian circles, they know of the greatness of God theologically, but you can know that without knowing Him. I pray that you know this truth. The Lord reigneth. Pray that we would live that truth. The Lord reigneth. But more importantly, that we would know the one who does reign. That we would know the one who does reign majestically and powerfully and assuredly and eternally and triumphantly and in truth and in righteousness. Do you know? Do you know the one who is able, constant, true, and dependable? When the floods have lifted up, when the floods have lifted up their voice, read those words. When the floods have lifted up their voice, oh, did you hear what she said? Did you hear what he said? And people are all in turmoil. The Lord reigneth. He's in control. When the floods lift up their voice, when the enemies of God get louder and louder and louder, you need to realize more and more, the Lord reigneth. The Lord reigneth. He's in control. Oh, we need to shut them up. You don't need to do that. God's in control. God's in control. You're not God. That is a basic truth that all God's people need to learn. We are not God. And we're not to do God's business. He reigns. He reigns. When the floods have lifted up their voice. When the floods lift up their waves. Now that's something you can see. And then we read the noise of the many waters. Oh, there's a lot of noise today. And God's people are being controlled by the noise many times. It'd be much better off if we were controlled by the Lord reigneth. The Lord reigneth. The noise of many waters, the mighty waves of the sea. When all these things happen, seek the one who reigns. Look to the one who reigns. Come to the one who reigneth. I guess the question is, do we know him well enough to cleave to him? Do we know him well enough to cleave to him? Do we know him well enough to embrace him? Cleave to the one who reigns. Embrace the one who reigns. Do you know him well enough to cast all upon him and just rest in him? The Lord reigneth. There's courage there. There's courage there. There's strength there. There's resolve there. There's steadfastness. The Lord reigneth. There's comfort. There's comfort. The Lord reigneth. And he knows exactly what he's doing. There's assurance in those words. There's much gladness in knowing this truth. The Lord reigneth. And even more so in knowing the one who reigns. So in the midst of the floods have lifted up, in the midst of the floods have lifted up their voice, in the midst of the floods have lifted up their waves, and in the midst of the noise of many waters, and the mighty waves of the sea, we need to know this: the Lord reigneth. And we need to know the one who reigns. We need to know him better every day. We need to know him better, more and more, all the time. This is what will help us. Not focusing upon the noise of the many waters. That's not going to help you any. Not spiritually. Won't help you at all. But this will help you spiritually. The Lord reigneth. I'm glad he does. I'm glad I know the Lord reigneth. I have to remind myself every now and then, the Lord's in control. The Lord reigneth. Just calm down. Everybody just calm down. The Lord's in control. Well, that's indifference. No, it's not indifference. That's just knowing a simple truth. The Lord reigneth. And there's no truth more powerful than that truth. We're not God. Well, I'm going to change such and such. Well, you go right ahead and try and waste your time and get caught and get stuck somewhere where you don't need to be stuck. You go right ahead. But I'm just going to believe that the Lord's in control. He reigns. And God help us to just trust him. Doesn't mean we do nothing, but it does mean that we trust him, that we believe him, that we lean upon him. We need to thank God for who he is. Just thank the Lord for who he is. We ought to be glad. We ought to rejoice in the Lord. Brother Ben, if you come and lead us in verse song.